It's certainly been tough times for shippers out there with the perfect storm, or what some are calling the Frankenstorm of conditions, sending rates soaring and shippers scrounging to find capacity. Shipper after shipper, especially in the consumer goods sector, has been citing rising logistics costs as delivering a blow to profits here in Q1 and for the rest of the year. One man who's not at all surprised about this is Mike Regan of TranzAct Technologies, who's been predicting this scenario for some time. He's joining us today as part of our Supply Chain Thought Leaders video series from his offices in the greater Chicago area. Mike, as always, thanks so much for joining me on the Supply Chain Television channel.
Dan, I'm really delighted to be here with you. I got a lot to cover today, I guess.
Okay, well, first, before we get into the meat of it, you should really be taking a victory lap for this call. Congratulations on, if you will, on predicting this perfect storm coming many months ago.
Well, Dan, it's kind of, a broken watch is right twice a day, right? So, or as a buddy of mine said, it's like the economist that predicted 12 of the last 2 recessions. Yeah. But we, in fact, have a lot of things going on, and it's, it's critical. About a week ago, the CEO of John Deere reported increased earnings and talked about how profitability had been hurt based on some log jams in the logistics and supply chain areas. You were kind enough to send me an article from the CEO of Tyson Foods talking about him specifically citing the increased cost of transportation and how it's going to affect their profitability. Over $100 million in increased cost because of the transportation issues. So I think that we've escalated this, as you mentioned, from a perfect storm to what we're calling the Frankenstorm.
All right, very good. Well, as bad as it is right now for shippers, and we all know that, you believe the eye of the storm, if you will, is really going to make landfall over the next 3 to 4 months. Why is that?
Well, Dan, there's a couple things going on. Obviously, as we see the impact of the Tax Act on the economy, right now, one of the things that you and I have consistently discussed was that just if the economy GDP grew by 2.5%, you'd see an impact on demand for tonnage. Well, we've seen the economy grow in 2017. We had GDP growth for a couple quarters of over 3%. And then in the first quarter or the fourth quarter of 2017, 2.5, 2.6%. So you've got economic growth. But the thing that's really going to hit, Dan, is that in April, the FMCSA will start putting carriers that are not ELD compliant out of service. For the benefit of your audience there, in December 18th, the electronic logging device became mandatory. But what had happened was that the FMCSA, in essence, gave carriers a grace period and said we would just ticket and fine you. We would not put you out of service. Well, starting in April, they are going to put you out of service if you are not ELD compliant. And we think one of the things that's been happening, Dan, is that some of the carriers, especially the smaller carriers, and many or some of the members within the Owner-Operator Independent Driver Association, OIDA, they have been making a decision, we think, to continue running the trucks simply because the rates make it worthwhile. But now if I have issues about being put out of service, that's an entirely different scenario. So we think we're going to lose some capacity there. The other component that we are seeing are some issues associated with driver capacity overall. When I was at the Stifel conference a couple weeks ago, Dan, and you hear the folks from Swift talking about the fact that in 2017, they made $35 million more with 1,200 fewer trucks. And I asked the CEO of Knight Swift whether that was their choice to not run the trucks. He said no, 100% of it was attributable to not being able to seat drivers. So when we take a look at April and May and running on into June and see a condition where more carriers are being put out of service, it's not like you can flick a switch and add more capacity. Virtually every major truckload carrier would tell you that their number one challenge right now is finding enough drivers to drive trucks. And I don't want to go on too long there, Dan, but one of the things that is compounding that situation is that some of the natural competitive forces which take truckers away from, or drivers away from the trucking industry are in full force. So that one of them is construction. And obviously with the hurricanes and things like wildfires in California, we're continuing to see an attrition of drivers. So we can't bring on enough drivers to add the kind of capacity that we expect to see leave the market in, once the carriers get put out of service.
Yeah, I think you're spot on that, Mike. And, I'll just note, though, we had similar scenarios a little bit in 2014, maybe, more closely representative in 2005, where we had, some real capacity issues. Those certainly caused some pain for a while, but then they kind of went away. Is that going to be the same thing here?
Well, I think, Dan, virtually everyone that I've talked to, the CEOs of major trucking companies, are concerned that what we have here is more of a systemic issue. So I could say that 2014, like you said, it was more or less an aberration. It was a temporary condition which sorted itself out after 4 to 5 months. 2005 was a little bit different, but I think here what we have going on in 2018 are some systemic issues, which is why a lot of the CEOs that I've been talking to say that the tight capacity that we're experiencing today is likely to continue on throughout 2018 and on into 2019. Now, in 2019, they're optimistic that we're going to see some things change that will allow us to add capacity. And probably the number one thing, Dan, that has to change is the pay for drivers. One of the things that at the Stiefel conference, at the Knit League conference, I was speaking out at the University of Denver in January. Everyone's talking about what's a market clearing rate to attract drivers into the industry. And the consensus seems to be that the drivers need to be paying in the high 60s, low 70s. Well, in order for that to occur, you're going to have to see some significant pay adjustments. So Werner, in the last 18 months, has increased their driver pay, according to Derek Leathers. I think the number he mentioned, Dan, was 17%. But the scary thing is we could see the driver pay having to go up an additional 15 to 20% in order to retain drivers.
Well, that's certainly going to add a whole bunch to costs as well. This is just a very, very interesting scenario here. There's been a lot of lamenting and hand-wringing. I've done plenty of it myself. But at the end of the day, what can shippers do about any of this, Mike?
Yeah, Dan, there's a couple of things that we're recommending. First of all, shippers need to take advantage of the technology that's out there. When I hear the VP for a major shipper say that right now in the current capacity conditions, they're going 12, 13, 14 deep into their TMS, what he's saying is we're having to contact 12, 13, 14 carriers before we can find someone to get the load. If you're doing that manually, it's an extraordinarily time-consuming process. One of the reasons we love our Constellation TMS, it's a great tool for automating the tendering, tracking, and tracing of freight. So using technology is number one. Second thing that we encourage people to do is to take a look at your processes. The extent to which you can provide advanced time for getting carriers makes a big deal. So much so, and what I mean by that is if I'm calling a carrier and expecting them to produce a piece of equipment the next day or within 2 days, you can expect to pay anywhere from 15 to 20% more for that truck than if you give that carrier 4 to 5 days. So one of the things we encourage people to do is to give your carriers more time. The third thing, and this is extremely, extremely important, Dan, and is something that more companies need to be doing, is to take a look at your business through the eyes of the carrier. Specifically, what happens when a carrier shows up at your facility or your suppliers or customers' facilities on your behalf? A couple of weeks ago, Dan, we released a great interview that's available at TranzAct.com. It's a gentleman who's the Senior Director of Transportation, Dave Venberg, from Ardent Mills. And in that video, we talk about the things that Ardent Mills did to, in fact, implement their Shipper of Choice program. Now, a lot of companies give lip service to wanting to be a shipper of choice, but when the rubber meets the road, they never change their practices about how the carriers are treated or how the equipment is being utilized. Well, in this interview, Dave talked about Ardent Mills, believe it or not, Dan, think about this for a moment, interviewing 800 drivers from their motor carriers to get a survey on what happens when they're working on behalf of Ardent Mills. It's had a tremendous impact on them being able to source capacity at a reasonable cost. So those three things, once again, Dan, are technology. You've got to take advantage of the technology. The second thing that we are encouraging to do is to take a look at your processes, things like advancing the tender time. The third thing are the practices, what happens when a carrier shows up. How you implement your shipper of choice program is important. And if there was a fourth one, Dan, that we also think is critically important, is now more than ever, data makes a difference. And specifically, what we want to be able to help people understand is that if I have better data, I then have the ability to find carriers that have my freight aligns with their network. Because in this capacity-laden environment, and you know as well as anyone, we say to everyone a couple of things that really make a difference are density and distance. And so aligning your freight with a carrier's network increases the chances and probability that you're going to get capacity at a reasonable cost. And that's how you navigate through this Frankenstorm.
All right, Mike. Well, some great insights as always. I'll note, as Mike mentioned there, TranzAct Technologies has a very excellent web page on all of this with news and videos and tools and all kinds of stuff. You just go to tranzact.com. You'll see the link here on your screen here and look for the perfect storage center. I guarantee you it's going to be worth your time. Mike, it's great stuff as always. Thanks so much for joining me again today on the Supply Chain Television channel.
Dan, a real privilege and a pleasure.